Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. Hope you enjoy. Look Before You Run, written by SpeedHump23. The Dol Agro had explored their system. They had expanded their civilization across 3 planets and moons in their home system. Intersystem ships reached incredible speeds in normal space, making trips to the furthest planet or colony in months. The Theoretical Travel Academy were working on the idea of faster-than-light travel. In their first test, they sent a small probe from the home world to the furthest colony. This colony was almost 6 light minutes away from home. The probe entered hyperspace and arrived at the colony orbit 6 seconds later. Sadly, every follow-up test never re-entered normal space. The Dol Agro turned away from hyperspace travel and started building generation ships to travel to their nearest neighbors. The LZs followed a similar path. They colonized their system, sent out some generational ships, and then tried hyperspace travel. This time, they had 2 probes make it back to real space, before nothing ever returned from then on. For hundreds of rotations, every civilization hit the same issue. They may get as many as 3 tests succeed in hyperspace travel, then nothing. At least most races did not make the same mistake in the Pada Rid did. After their first probe succeeded, they packed as much of their civilization into warships as they could. This desperate measure was to escape the rogue black hole that was going to pass near their home system. Only 3 million were able to make it back on board. They had built as many ships as possible, but ran out of time. Only the first ship returned to real space, with nothing ever being seen of the other ships. Almost 90% of their civilization was lost. Some races met others in real space, shared stories of their attempts to travel faster than light, and became friends or enemies. Many rotations later, a slower-than-light galactic federation had been formed. One of the members of the federation was the Voice Aga. They were a peaceful race who specialized in cryogenic systems, which they shared with any who asked. As a result, they had quite a large space infrastructure around their home system planets. Their officer in charge of local traffic around home world was rather surprised to see an unknown probe ship exit hyperspace almost on top of their planet, scan their system, then disappear back into hyperspace. The report to the planet leaders was seen as interesting, but dismissed. It must have been a fluke that some race's first attempt to travel into hyperspace must have made it to their home system by fluke. If history was anything to judge by, the race who sent that probe would never enter hyperspace again. The Foyet had been in existence for as long as they could remember. Their scientists had suggested that they had evolved from the same of the various clumps of gases which seemed to enjoy swirling around the hills and plains of their existence. They did not seem to live on a planet. In fact, they did not know what a planet was. The skies at night looked the same as they did in the day, as they did not have a sun, nor stars. The terrain of their home world is made up of fields, hills, rocky outcrops, crystalline impact craters, gas clouds, and buildings of the Foyet. Every few generations or more, a new impact crater would appear, often without warning. Sometimes the crater would be small, sometimes it would be massive. Legends tell of a line of craters which stretched across the Etu region. The craters wiped out hundreds of families, and full hands' worth of mountains were now crystalline holes. Even rarer than crystalline impacts were the melted air. These lines of fire would appear for a brief time, then slowly dissipate. Sometimes the flames would rise to catch the passing families, and their scars and stories would be passed around the people. Often, these lines of fire would precede a crystalline expansion. The traffic coordinator for the home world had just returned from several days' testimony before the world leaders, when a screen showed another hyperspace displacement in the same spot as the probe. While hyperspace travel did not work, all space workers were trained in the basic principles, so the energy flare showing an object exiting hyperspace was still studied in class. For circumstances just like the probe a few days ago. This time the flare of light was massive. It almost overloaded the optical scanners. The radar system showed a ship of immense size, and the alarms reserved for slower-than-light raiders entering the system went into overload. System defense ships were scrambled from their launchers. Pirate attacks were not common, but a new race entering their system on slower-than-light ships would normally be met with cautious escorts. But this time, there had been no weeks of warning that a ship was coming. The Griffith drive spooled down as the crew of the Void Voyager, Earthship Void Voyager, aka Evie, reset scanners and systems for real or non-hit space. The nickname for hyperspace had been gained popularity over the last few years, which all crews of all Terran ships taught how to act when traveling. The probe which had entered the system a T-week earlier had scanned the various radio and other spectrums to grab a full system download to allow the big brains back on Earth to plug the language into translators. As a result, the Evie had started broadcasting messages of greeting, peace, and please don't shoot in all local languages as soon as the ship had stabilized. The fact that the numerous small ships which had started moving towards the Evie were not shooting was a good sign. A few minutes after a small patrol ship had stopped relative to Evie, a message was broadcast to them. Alien vessel, welcome to the home system of the Voice Aga. Prepare for a customs, diplomatic, and quarantine ship to arrive shortly. Captain Wales had been to a few systems on first contact so far, and this side of the quadrant seemed to be much more connected than others. So these Voice Aga seemed more amazed by their arrival method than the actual arrival. The standard biopack had been prepared for the Voice Aga scientists to examine to make sure none of the crew of Evie were going to pose any issues. The Voice Aga were carbon-based air breathers, and initial probe results did not flag any likely issues. Once the scans and initial diplomatic conversations were passed, Captain Wales and his command crew were invited to the leadership plaza. The planet's leaders wanted to greet them as new friends. The command crew were walking towards the open-air meeting area, having landed via their shuttles nearby. Captain Wales smiled as his navigator had started the now customary book on how many questions they would face before the Hyperspace One was asked. Wales was glad he opted in. His bet was 0 other questions. He had seen the lines of leaders and scientists waiting for them as they flew overhead and their way to the spaceport nearby. The facial expressions might be alien to them, but even he could see the look of expectation on some of those faces. The prime voice of the Voice Aga's leadership group had not even finished her greeting when one of the scientists had yelled out his question. The stunned silence was broken only by a whispered curse from the navigator, as he promised to pay the bet when he returned to the ship. Captain Wales smiled and stepped forward. The response was well rehearsed by this point. 172 local revolutions ago, 107 of Terran ones, a scientific study group on our home world had worked out how to access hyperspace. The decision to send a probe to test the new drive system had been unanimously supported around the system. Many people wanted to test the probe by sending a supply ship to the new Pluto colony, which was always in dire straits as supply ships took almost a year to get there. Others wanted to send a probe to Alpha Centauri to see what was there. The decision to just send a probe into hyperspace and take a look was the suggestion of a grad student working in the team. Nye Griffith had suggested, "Isn't it better to look before we run?" As a result, the probe had very slowly entered into hyperspace and was loaded with cameras, recorders of all types, and even a few transmitters. A suggested test was to see if radio or sound waves worked in the same as in hyperspace. There were 2 surprises after the probe disappeared. The first was the transmitter seemed to be working, with the probe sending back the very strange broadcast. The second surprise was when the broadcast was decoded. If it was not for the fact that the first transmission back was going to be recording of the great Carl Sagan's pale blue dot speech, it would have been almost impossible to realize what was happening. The transmission was supposed to be about 3.5 minutes long and would allow the team on Earth to check a known transmission against the environment the probe was in. Strangely, though, the transmission took over 2 weeks to finish. The computers managed to speed it up by massive factors to return it to normal time, and the scientists realized that time is moving much slower in hyperspace. With the speed factor worked out, the probe was sent the message to compress and submit the data it received so fast. The first vision received showed a pale green environment with strange shapes and bursts of light moving across the camera's view. This surprised the various scientists. They had been expecting a void. Even greater surprise was the appearance of beings looking at the probe with obvious intelligence and interest. The probe had been accorded local hours worth of data in the hyperspace realm and showed the aliens cautiously milling around the probe. The probe was recording light, radio, and electromagnetic sound waves. They had space in the probe, so they added a microphone for the fun of it, and even gas sampling. As a result, the data sent back to Earth allowed them to realize the beings were speaking to each other about the probe. It took a while for humanity to be able to communicate back and forth with the hyperspace beings called the Foryet. The Foryet eventually told us of the lines and the fire of the crystallized eruptions in their lands, and it did not take us long to realize that these were craft traveling through hyperspace, and everything making it to their target space by chance, burning the air as they went past, or hitting some terrain, or passing a gas cloud, fauna, or family, or even a line of fire from a previous transit. With such a force that matter was crystallized and left as a permanent roadblock to any future travel. The joy of the Foryet expressed to learn that they were not alone in the creation, and that the Terrans would work on ways to stop the lines of fire and eruptions from afflicting the lands in the future, resulted in them helping the Terrans work out a better way to route their ships through the lands of the Foryet. The end result was the humans were now going round to each of the races which had tried to enter hyperspace and pop in to say hi to whomever was there. The true explanation of the entry points of the lines of the fire was now known, and the scars in the land now showed where the race had entered the ship into hyperspace. As always, though, the probe was sent through first, and the probe sent to the system occupied by the Padra was able to start a rescue of the remaining population, who had fled their system on slower-than-light ships as the black hole approached. The Galactic Federation now had access to faster-than-light travel, and were able to safely spread out across the galaxy. There were even several brave members of the Foryet who had asked to travel to non-hit space to see what stars looked like. These travelers from hit space often looked like statues of gas as they seemed to not be moving, and they often needed escorts to protect them from accidents. The fact that they moved so slow continued to confuse some scientists, as they could not understand how hyperspace beings would move so slow, and the answer from the famous Foryet comedian was, "Have you been to their realm? There is nothing to see, so why rush?" The Foryet representative on Earth was often heard, after his speech was sped up, to express his appreciation that the undergrad Nye Griffin had been listened to, and humanity had look before you run. End of story. I would quickly like to thank our Tier 5 patrons and channel members: Casper Arnholt, Cam Maxwell, it's difficult to pronounce, Lord Arishikal, Dragzoon WRE, and Arcadian. Thank you very much.